We are going to discuss a report that is relatively hot off the press. It's the Congressional Budget Office's monthly budget review for April 2020. This happens to be a rather pivotal month, and there's some serious data in this one. So maybe before we dive into it, you can give a quick rundown or reminder for our listeners of what the budget review is for CBO.
Yeah, every month the CBO puts out a review of the budget, which is why they call it the monthly budget review.
Man, that's so intuitive. I just
Yeah, well,
wow.
and this one came out in April, which is why they call it the monthly budget review for April. Uh, April tends to be a pivotal month. Normally, the monthly budget review is something that you kind of look at. Well, what happens in one particular month isn't all that important. It's really the cumulative thing. But April does tend to be an important month because there are a lot of tax filing deadlines in April. So it can be a real bellwether of where the budget is going to end up, where the deficit or surplus in the old days might end up for the year. So we thought we would put together a review of the budget review. This one is really stunning. I mean, nobody's ever seen anything like it because April is normally a surplus month because of all the money that comes in from the income tax filings. And this was a deficit in April, which is unusual in itself, but the deficit was something like $737 billion for April versus $160 billion surplus last year. So that gives you some sort of a comparison about how quickly things have changed.
Were there any factors that especially contributed to such a high deficit? I know that overall the economy is just plummeting very rapidly, and I'm assuming revenue was down. But were there any other additional factors that really pushed this deficit exceptionally high?
Well, yeah. I mean, there were a couple, and just to give you a sense of the proportion, the revenue fell by 55% compared to last year. The spending increased by 160%. So you were going pretty heavy on both sides there. Really, on the revenue side, I don't think the the full impact of the economic downturn, the coronavirus, is caught up to us yet. Basically, the revenue shortfall was caused by the administration postponing the filing date for income taxes until July. So that money, didn't come in. It will come in July, some of it, but it will be reduced from, because of the economy. And as CBO pointed out, between now and then, there may be some businesses and individuals that go into bankruptcy, and that money isn't going to get paid. So some of that will, on the revenue side, will be recouped. But you did see the beginning of some of the tax credits from the CARES Act. So you're beginning to see the first, drops of snow in a blizzard. On the spending side, a lot more happened in April because you had the stuff that won't be recouped, because you had the checks, the individual checks go out. That was the biggest change. But there were also some Medicare had some accelerated payments that went out the door quickly. Hospital payments, grants to states and local governments. A lot of that stuff that was in the first four acts of Congress that were passed in response to this began to pay out in April. So while the deficit was very big in April, we're probably going to have some very big deficits to come. This is by no means the end of that. It is the beginning. We're beginning to see the first effects of the coronavirus on the budget.
You don't really give the impression that many, whether they're government officials, elected leaders, or economists, expect to see I guess, a bridging of that deficit gap, but perhaps a much wider gap by the time we get to the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah, I think that's true. Is that this? We may be doing a show on the May monthly budget report and the June.
Suddenly, the budget review is very important.
Well, yeah, it is. It's amazing, but we just have seen the tip of the iceberg with the drop off in economic growth. I mean, it fell at about almost a 5% rate in the first quarter, but everybody expects the second quarter to be much, much, much worse. As high as like 40% on an annual rate. So that's going to feed into the budget. There'll probably be, and some of these things like the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, in April, that was not a huge expense because there were just some preliminary expenditures. But when these loans, which will turn into grants, begin to pay out, that'll show up big time in the budget by hundreds of billions of dollars that aren't showing up yet. So, yeah, some of these things are just beginning to kick in. And then there's the fact that Congress is probably going to enact some other measures that might increase, their increased spending or cut taxes further. So CBO is still suggesting that by the end of the year, the full year's deficit is going to be approaching $4 trillion.
I've seen quotes pop up in the news about some elected leaders are expressing some concern over the size of the deficit and the long-term addition of mass amounts of debt, given that we already have a $23 trillion national debt. Do you think that's a sentiment that should continue? Are we at the point where we can start to be concerned about those long-term deficits and the long-term addition to our debt? Or are we at a point in your mind where this is still such an imminent crisis that really the blank check perspective is still an appropriate one?
Uh, you should never forget about the deficit and the debt, but you can put it at the back of your mind or on the back burner. And I think we are still in that situation. I wouldn't say blank check is appropriate. I'd still go with the timely, targeted, and temporary approach so that you're not making the long-term problem worse. But, bad as the number is for April, it's important to remember that it was done deliberately. I mean, it's not like it came from nowhere. And there are other numbers that you could cite too. I mean, the fact that we've got about a million three people infected by the coronavirus in the United States, and over 80,000 deaths. Many of those in the month of April. So yes, the number is large, but the problem, both the health problem and the economic problem, is large. And this is just one of the things that we're going to have to work through. The first thing frankly, the way to get the budget back under control is get the economy growing again. And the way to get the economy growing again is to get the virus under control. And that may take a while.
This is Facing the Future. I've been talking to Concord Coalition Executive Director Bob Bixby about the CBO's monthly budget review for April 2020. Thanks again for joining the show, Bob.
All right. Thanks, Chase.